On this computer, I won't do like Matt did and record to the cloud, and sometimes it doesn't work.
By sometimes you mean most of the time.
Yep. Okay. All right. Here we go. Thank you, everyone, for joining another episode of hashtag Real Talk with Aaron Bregg. Today, I have two visitors or two guests, whichever you like to prefer. Matt Nelson's going to join us and be my sidekick in this meeting. But more importantly, today's guest is Ken, and I don't want to butcher your last name, so I'm going to say when you do your introduction, I'll have you say your last name so I don't butcher it because I'm notorious for butchering last names. Ken is with us from Abnormal Security, and today we're going to be talking about social engineering and all the crazy things that are going on between the Twitter hack, the Iranians making a huge move in the social engineering space, and like the article on Krebs on Security that talks about some of the things with SendGrid, which is owned by Twilio. So let me be quiet for a minute. And Ken, would you like to introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background on how you got into information security?
Yeah, so thanks for having me, Aaron and Matt. My name is Ken Liao. I am the VP of Cybersecurity Strategy at Abnormal, which is really code for I'm actually in marketing, but deep down I'm actually a product guy, and so I'm a practitioner in the past and familiar with a lot of the different security tools, and that's why we kind of use a different terms because no one really wants to talk to the marketing guy, right? So getting into security, years ago, I actually started as a solution engineer at Proofpoint, and this is back in the day when I would say that email security wasn't really a security solution. It was all about just email hygiene. We were dealing with spam. Yes, we were dealing with viruses, but at the end of the day, the types of attacks weren't a real security threat to the organization, right? Another Viagra message inside your inbox wasn't a security threat. But then we really started to see the attacks begin to evolve, and they went from spam, and we started to see those malicious attachments starting to come in, and that's where you had campaigns that had attachments and bad links, and it was right around this time, and I probably want to say this is probably circa 2010 to 2012. When email security started to shift from being something that was looked at and bought by IT and messaging, and it was really now a security product and and the security teams were involved. And so that's kind of when I would say my background sort of started really in security was kind of that transition. And that's when we started working with CISOs, started working with security architects, SOC teams. For me, I've always been on the vendor side. So I went from email security, spent time on the endpoint security space as well. And then security analytics with SOC tools. And so now I'm back to email security.
Which is kind of where it all begins, right?
Right.
All right. So we got some nice questions lined up. The first and foremost, obviously on the top of everyone's minds, what are some of your immediate thoughts about the Twitter hack? Especially, we give this podcast to kind of like small and medium businesses and trying to like educate people on security. When an average person, right, that's not super security minded sees something like Twitter being, hacked, obviously there's a lot of fear, like, well, I'm just a mom and pop company, maybe with 10 to 15 people. I don't have the kind of money and security resources. If this can happen to, Twitter, why do I even try? Why do I even spend money? So kind of what are some of your thoughts around the social engineering attack on Twitter?
Yeah. It really shows the power of social engineering. Now by all accounts, it sounds like there were multiple parties involved in this particular attack, so that they were collaborating. And the root of it was this, relatively young man who managed to convince an employee to pass credentials over to him, and then he kind of spread laterally. I think in addition to what you said about someone, or an organization the size of Twitter who has the resources for a full security team, what's also most interesting to me about this attack too was when we generally think about social engineering, and we deal a lot with enterprises, but we like to blame kind of our non-technical end users, right? Like it's the person in the HR department, or it's the
their
accounts
fault.
payable person, right? And we feel like, oh, we're in security, or we're in IT, like we're too good to fall for this stuff, and it's everyone else that's the problem. And this really wasn't the case. This was someone in IT that ultimately got socially engineered and passed over those credentials. And so I think more than anything, for me, in addition to, yes, it showcases the power of social engineering, but it also points out the fallibility of all of us as human beings, right? Even people who, we think generally should know better, right? And so, this is not by any means to really point a finger and say, this person, really fell for it. I think we all really, at the end of the day, are vulnerable to social engineering. I mean, this is kind of from the very beginning of security, this has been one of the weakest points, right? And so, that to me is one of the biggest takeaways is really just how none of us are immune to falling for this.
Do you see, I mean, obviously we can't get into specifics because, you can't give secret sauce or customer data away. But do you see the level of sophistication? Because we also have the Iranian, the recent Iranian attack. They've been doing it for a while, right? So it's just, everybody's talking about the election stuff. Oh my gosh, Russia, China, Iran, they've been doing all this stuff. They're going to mess with the elections. And me being in the information security industry, I get kind of frustrated because that's sensationalization from both sides of the fence, right? Like it saying this is good for this party if you say it this way, and saying it this is good for this party this way. But the fact is, and this has been going on for a while. It just seems like the level of sophistication and some of these emails and some of the social engineering has just started to raise. Is this more like an eye-opening moment for, say, like an Iranian threat actor, or maybe the Chinese going, wow, okay, you know what? We still got the Nigerian email scams where it's bad spelling and everything else. Like, some of these countries have the money to spend to either, hire somebody from the outside or get somebody on the inside of the US. And then the language barrier is gone and this barrier is gone. Like, are you starting to see that it's across the board with the data that you're seeing at our normal, or is it still pretty much the big players that we really need to be afraid of?
I think there's really a pretty broad spectrum. And what we see is there's still, at the end of the day, whether it be, certainly there's the state actors that are like you said, in play here, right? So it's the Russians or it's the Iranians, but even just from a for-profit threat actor, it's really a pretty simple economics driver here, right? And so there's going to be some set of those actors who will resort to, lesser techniques because that still works for them, and maybe that's the skill level and that's the amount of investment that they want to invest into those type of attacks. And so we still see I would say, quote unquote, those simpler scams occurring. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you do find folks who really kind of advance their techniques, and the attacks are significantly more or significantly trickier. And I'll give you just an example of that, where we tend to think of, hey, there's one email that comes in that is an attack, and we're starting to see a progression where there are attacks that really don't take place over just one email, but they take place over a conversation, which may take place over months, and over 12 different exchanges. And that first email that comes in doesn't even resemble anything that you would generally think of as an attack, right? It's really just to kind of initiate a conversation. And once you get that initial engagement, there's a bit of this snowball effect where it begins to pick up momentum, and each exchange almost kind of begins to validate that attacker as a legitimate business owner or legitimate entity. And so you end up in this, imagine getting an email one day where you're now, there's 12 emails ahead of you, and it finally gets to you, and it's talked to 6 of your coworkers, right? That there's just, it brings a level of legitimacy.
Yeah.
And then that's when the attack occurs, right? And so those are the kind of things that I think that we're starting to see as a very, very advanced style of attack that's just extraordinarily difficult to detect.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of interesting points there. One is the patience that we're starting to see some of these attackers have, right? It's not a, I've got 5 minutes and I'm gonna go try to break through a firewall. I mean, some of these things that we're seeing now are very slow and very methodical, and it's actually a hacker building trust with the person that they are trying to attack. The other aspect, Ken, that you mentioned there that I find fascinating is the financial aspect of it. While we look at people maybe going after, I think if we think of hackers like in movies or whatever, right, or TV shows, it's always some big multi-million dollar scheme that they're going after. But I'm hearing a lot of instances where um, I'll get the statistics wrong, but it was something like, a security professional in some of these countries maybe makes $8,000 or $10,000 a year. If they switch over and go to the other side of things and they start doing small attacks, maybe instead of trying to get $1 million from somewhere, they're just trying to get 5,000 here, 4,000 there, 10,000 here. And if they do that successfully 2, 3, 4 times, maybe they've quadrupled their household income without having to try to go after a giant company. So if you think of the small and medium businesses and maybe how vulnerable that they could be because of not having the resources, but boy, if you're a bad actor and you're attacking that level of company and you're making a few $1,000s here and there, it's that financial driver I think is really strong on a global scale right now.
Wow. But that is a good segue to the next question for you, Ken. And I'm gonna make our secure email and security awareness teams watch this video because I think they need to hear like what you just said. So we get this from time to time, and Matt knows this. Why is email security more than just malicious attachment protection?
Yeah, and I'll pick up a little bit where Matt just left off, and for me, there's an economic side of things where we started to see the shift towards malware because that was more profitable at the end of the day, right? So we went from spam way back then, as we were talking about, and then that was at a very, very low conversion rate because how many fake Rolexes were you going to sell? How many off-market Viagra bottles were you going to sell? And so the more profitable way was to start using malware, and then the installation of Trojans to start stealing banking credentials, or we started to see the ransomware starting to take effect, which is still obviously a problem even to this day. But those attacks definitely required a little bit more planning, if not technical skill, to execute those type of attacks, right? You had the right kits, the right targets. Now you got to figure out which Trojans run on which target machines, and so there's a lot more than just spray and pray in those environments. And that's really where we also started to see the technical tools started to evolve, where now that we knew that those were the kind of things that were coming down, we introduced sandboxing approaches, and we got really much better at identifying those type of attacks. And so if you're the attacker, these tools are hurdles and obstacles for you to get to your final payday, right? Your objectives. And so that's where we started to see, I would say, the shift again, where let's go use social engineering. It's a tried and true technique, and if there's a way that we can monetize that social engineering, these are ways to get around the existing security controls that we have. And so that's, again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, there's that economic driver again, and the type of attacks that we're talking about, where we can Matt talked about, hey, smaller businesses, we may be looking at a few $1,000s here or there. It may be as simple as a simple payroll fraud, right? Like an employee who wants to get their bank account changed. And so we change that. Or we find things that are like small invoice frauds, right? Like here's a vendor who sends you an invoice and you just pay the invoice. But then you also see larger attacks that hit the larger organizations because the same techniques work there too, right? We all have payroll departments, we all have accounts payable departments, and so that's where I think the shift has really been made. Is the security tools have kind of put up that barrier where putting a Trojan onto an endpoint is just a lot harder to do these days. And I would say, I would go as far as to say, email security was not the only control that was in place in order to succeed there, right? So if email security missed it and you were trying to install a Trojan, you still had endpoint security, endpoint tools in place. You had a number of other backstops, but with social engineering, like there is none, right? And so there's this really, like, you have one shot to go identify it, and then you kind of like, then the attacker's kind of in the clear after that. And so I think that's why we're starting to see this shift. And I think the FBI stats actually support that as well. This is, one of the biggest problems that we're facing.
Good. Perfect. Thank you for that answer, because you're doing a great job like teeing up these next questions. So great guest so far. So there's a lot of people don't know about DMARC, so they might not understand the question because it's an acronym, and Matt and I give each other about acronyms all the time. But how can things like DMARC and some of the functionality that abnormal security has help with that, right? Because again, spoofing comes into play. DMARC helps with that. Some of the nuances that that abnormal does. So I could almost say, hey, I already have a secure email gateway. Why do I need abnormal?
Yeah. A lot of questions in there. So let me start with maybe DMARC. And this is really sort of embarrassing for me. I know what DMARC is, and I can almost never remember exactly what the acronym stands for. I remember DKIM, I remember SPF. And again, familiar with DMARC, but people always ask me, what does it stand for? And I go, I always draw this mind blank. But DMARC is a method of authenticating the sending email that's coming in and where it's coming from, and is it the source that you think it is, right? So DMARC is particularly helpful where spoofing is the technique that the attacker is using. So I'm pretending to be your bank. I'm sending you an email that says you need to update your account information. DMARC can really sort out if that really truly is the sender that they're claiming to be. Now, that unfortunately only knocks out a percentage, and I would say the simpler side of social engineering attacks that we're seeing today. I mean, certainly I am a proponent of DMARC. I think it's a good thing that we all need to embrace it and do. But the most sophisticated attacks that we're seeing won't be stopped by something like DMARC. And there's a couple of things that are at play. One, the attackers may be coming from a Gmail address as an example. And one of the examples that I use frequently is when I used to travel pre-pandemic, I would send a lot of messages from my mobile phone, my iPhone. And I've got both my personal email on there as well as my work email. And inevitably, I'll send a work email and it'll actually come from my Gmail address, right? And it's just purely an accident because I start typing the email and I forget to change the from, and my default is actually my Gmail. And so I'll send you an email, or I'll send someone on my team an email, and it'll actually come from my Gmail address. And so that's a very legitimate sort of accidental use case of a Gmail account. And so we need to account for that. And yet the attackers will also be very able to send emails coming from Gmail accounts. And so DMARC doesn't help in identifying that, hey, that's not who they say they are, because Gmail authenticates just fine.
Yep.
The other scenario that we find is compromised accounts in the first place. And one of the mechanisms in which attackers are getting into more complex organizations, which might have, really top tier security teams, is they'll go after a vendor, right? They'll go after their supply chain, compromise the vendor, which may not have all of the same security controls, and use that as a launching pad into the target organization. And also I would, urge some of your listeners here, where they might actually be targets of fairly sophisticated actors because of their supply chain and how they're connected, right? And so that's something that I think we all need to be aware of. You might say, hey, I'm a smaller enterprise. Nation state folks don't want to be targeting me. And that's not completely true. We definitely see the use of smaller organizations as launch pads into further attacks. And so that's why, going back to the DMARC is, again, serves a very good purpose, but doesn't address the entire spectrum of the attacks that we sort of would classify under socially engineered attacks, such as business email compromise. So that said, you asked the broader question. I have email security today. I've got security awareness training. What else? I'm covered, right? And the short answer is maybe not. And I mentioned the FBI stats earlier. So the FBI, the 2019 report, which was a retrospective view at 2019, came out in January, February of this year, highlighted that business email compromise, which is the social engineering attack that we're talking about here, was more than 50% of all the financial loss as it related to cyber security. So it's more than 50%, right? So if we think of email security as, hey, there isn't a single company that doesn't have a secure email security tool in place, right? I mean, and we all largely do some sort of security awareness training. If those were truly effective, I don't think that would be the 50+% of the total loss, right? And so I would say that the stats really kind of speak for themselves, that we're not doing a good job in this particular area today. And I would add one thing before we beat ourselves too much on that one, in that it's really hard to solve this problem, right? I mean, we talked about the sophistication of the attacks that we just highlighted with Matt highlighted the patient attacker, which is taking time to build up a relationship with the target. And these are really hard problems to solve. And so, I don't want to, say that, hey, we haven't been doing our job, right? I don't think that's truly the case. But what I think is really sad to me is that when I talk to CISOs and even CIOs, we talk about social engineering attacks, and some of them, some people say, yeah, no, I do have the problem. So, they don't have the statement that I'm good. Like, do I have a problem or not? There's actually people that I talk to that would say, no, I have a problem. And you ask them like how they're dealing with it today, and they say security awareness training. And there's a part of me that, as a vendor and a technologist, that makes me sad about that statement, because by saying that, you're giving up, right? You're basically saying, like, there are no technical controls that I believe in that can solve this problem, and so I'm gonna go just train my end user to go address the problem, which in a security world just kind of, like, again, it's an unfortunate state.
It's a punt. I'm like, let's call a spade, and that's, that is a punt. It's not untrue, right? Security awareness training is so important.
Absolutely.
But it is easy to say that this is going to fix it, because I think I was on LinkedIn, and I really wish I would have saved it, but somebody on LinkedIn was talking about how you get one thing. It was, says here, you have enough budget to do one thing for information security. What would that thing be? And some people were trying to Kobayashi Maru it and split it into two, but it's like, no, I'm like, you only have enough funds to do one thing. And it was very interesting to see a lot of people said security awareness. Some said other security tools. So even the mindset of like, if I did nothing else but security awareness, that would solve the problems. But to your point, it's not.
Yeah.
Well, I think another thing that I would throw in there about security awareness training is that I don't, and I'm someone that does security awareness training presentations. I don't know that we have updated what security awareness training means to facilitate things like a vendor compromised email, where you think that Bill from vendor ABC, you've been working with this person for years, and now all of a sudden it's not actually Bill that's sending you this email. It's this hacker, and so it's a different thing than teaching people, well, don't click on links, or check the URLs, or all the kind of the typical security awareness training stuff that we've been doing for a long time, which is good. But um, some of the stuff through the social engineering is becoming so sophisticated that we probably have to up our game not only in terms of the technology that we're using to block some of this stuff, but our security awareness training probably needs to be updated as well.
That's a really great point, and I hadn't even thought about the content that goes into a lot of the security awareness training programs that we're using today, and also just like we talked about DMARC, I'm also a big proponent of security awareness training, in addition to making people aware, which is key. But there's also that compliance angle that we have to do this in a lot of cases as well.
I think what I'm saying is that I'm realizing through this conversation I need to add a couple more slides to my security awareness.
And I'll send a bill to Optiv for
You're right.
So that leads us to my next question for you. What is the one thing that you would like all CIOs to do or to listen to? You have I'll give you a magic wand, you wave it, and every single CIO in the country has to listen to Ken and do exactly what he says, but you only get one thing.
It would be this podcast, right? All of the great knowledge that we're sharing here. No, in kind of all seriousness, you asked also a little bit about what abnormal security does, and I kind of left the last question with, it's an unfortunate state that we're leaving this to security awareness training. But abnormal security does have a unique approach. We call ourselves I hate to use the term next generation of email security, but that's what we kind of
we need a new marketing jargon, is what you're saying.
I know.
Next gen has been beat to death.
And I'll explain just very briefly the sort of the concept and the idea behind what we do, and then I would say then leave it to the CIOs to say, hey, is this an interesting enough approach and a technology that you may want to kind of take a look at it, or at least consider it, whether or not it's from us. It's something that I think is important to kind of, you better understand the threat vector once you understand why we're approaching it the way that we are. But if you look at a kind of a traditional email security approach, when an email comes in, you scan it for a whole bunch of, I would say, threat indicators, right? You look at and say, what is the sending IP address? Do I know if that is a bad IP or not? I want to do my email authentication. I want to take any attachments and I want to sandbox them. I want to go look at links. And if all of that looks okay, then, hey, it's safe, right? And then I deliver that email. But as we talked about with social engineering attacks, all of those things that I just mentioned are gonna pass checks, right? There's nothing in there that will trigger any one of those things to say, hey, this is bad. Mm-hmm. Abnormal takes a very, very different approach, because what we do is we look at the context of a message when it's coming in. And so we're looking at the communication patterns of the individuals that are in question. So, hey, if you sent me, Aaron, if you sent me a message, it would kind of start to look at what is our communication pattern? What is our relationship, right? So not only are we looking at the individuals, we're looking at departments, organizations. And so we really understand the people involved in the communication. the business processes that are involved inside of the organization. And then we understand the supply chain more broadly and how all of the third parties are supposed to be interacting. And it's really that level of context that allows us to essentially apply what we call anomalous behavior detection to spot those outliers. So Matt talked to, the example that Matt talked about, which was, hey, I've been interacting with Bob, my vendor, for 5 years. I get an email from him once a month and we go back and forth. So that is a established relationship, but I can still catch outliers if I really understand what the context of that communication starts to look like. And it all sounds pretty easy when you start to say, okay, I understand people, I understand business processes, and I understand the supply chain. But the reason that we are able to do it so well is that we integrate directly into the Microsoft Office 365 Graph API. And what that allows us is it gives us a lot of information beyond just looking at email. So I have the ability to look at identity and contact and calendar and user events and all of that. I can actually pull from additional systems. And with that, that's effectively, that's the same information that a human being is actually using. So the reason we think security and awareness training works is, as an end user, I have a lot more context in my head about my relationships and hey, should I be getting a invoice from Bob? Or it's always Kate that sends me the invoices, not Bob. Bob's my, and so those are all kind of things that are in people's heads. And so when you start to access this additional information, you can really begin to get that baseline context, and really that's what allows us to have that level of understanding that allows us to identify these type of attacks. And I think what's most important about what we do is it all sounds like this magic AI ML, but I've also been in security long enough to know that that's a very dangerous position to take when you say, hey, my system's super smart, don't worry about it, right? Trust me. And so we're very, very transparent. So it's not a black box. We expose and tell you exactly why we make the decisions that we do. And so that one, I think it's really important, because if you're a security practitioner, you want to develop a level of trust with the system. And so the system has to be able to convince you that we made the right decision. And over time, that trust will build, but we always will have that explainability and that transparency. And then the last thing I'll just offer as well, and this is particularly, I think, interesting for the CIOs, is that I mentioned we integrate directly to Office 365. So one of the nice things, unlike a lot of, I would say, more traditional security email security solutions, is that we're not in line. And so we don't require any MX record changes or any mail flow changes. It just, it literally takes seconds to integrate via the API.
No fan
CIOs love that because I'm making their Office 365 investment even better, right? You spend a boatload of money with Microsoft. I'd like to, make sure you're getting your maximum dollar for that. And so we really leverage that. And your earlier question of, hey, I've got all this email security already. We really do a good job of augmenting those existing controls. Like we don't affect them at all.
Well, that's good. I couldn't tell you how many times in my years of information security at Spectrum Health where it's just an agent. It's only this size and it's only going to take this much CPU. If I had $1 for every time I was told that, and then
hey, I used to be in the endpoint space. I probably sold you some of those words.
All right, we're doing okay on time. I try and keep these around between 30 and 40 minutes because I know people don't have as long as commute as they used to. So actually, this is good to segue into the next question. What are your biggest fears for the future? And let me preface that with a little bit, Larry. You talked a lot about AI, and I'm glad you used ML in there. And AI is artificial intelligence. We got to do the acronym game here in machine learning, because AI is just used so much in like marketing materials that it's almost like a taboo saying now that we do AI. Yeah. So you talked about the machine learning, and you talked about, really taking end user behavior to the next level. So is this one of your biggest fears for the future? Is machine learning getting flipped over to the bad guy's side? Like, what are you most fearful for?
Yeah. So the short direct answer to, is machine learning flipping over to the bad guys, and undoubtedly so. I mean, I'm certain that those tools are being used for malicious intent, and also, you've heard of there's a whole field of, when you have machine learning, like I forget what the term is, but if you know there's a machine learning model in place, you can purposely um, feed specific types of information to it to cause it to basically make bad decisions, right? So there's also there's actually a very specific term for it that escapes me at the moment. And then you could go, if you want to really kind of get a little bit more blue sky. I mean, the whole idea of things like deep fakes is a little bit frightening to think about, and how that might be leveraged over time. Now today, I don't see that, or we haven't seen that necessarily being used in attacks for kind of the business email compromise types of attacks. But if one thing's kind of come clear over the last several months as part of the pandemic, is that we've accelerated the amount of digital transformation that may have taken several years. Like we've probably compressed what likely would have naturally taken place over the next 3 to 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And we've probably seen that acceleration happen in probably about 6 months, right?
Which is
and we
phenomenal
really see a lot.
and
right?
scary.
It's scary, right? And so to think about these other types of things where we will find newer ways of continuing to leverage social engineering attacks, including things like deepfakes. And again, I don't know how that will manifest itself,
Mm-hmm.
but it is scary to think about those types of things kind of getting an evolutionary turbocharge, so to speak, and then seeing them kind of play out. So honestly, those are probably the things that kind of like go, ooh, this will be scary to go see in the next few years.
I didn't even think about that. I mean, I've been trying to not pass judgment on Twitter for what happened, right? Because to your point, it can happen to anybody. But how lucky they were in regards to that kid was just, one, wanted recognition, two, some quick cash and everything else, because there's a nightmare scenario using that social engineering through email or over the phone or what they did, then have a deep fake ready, right? Because you've hired out, as a joke, hey, guy in Eastern Europe, do this deep fake with Trump saying X, Y, and Z, here's $100 and this is gonna be so funny. I'm gonna put in this parody site, where I know that is BS, right? Because I'm working on compromising this, this Twitter information. I have the deep fake ready. Now I got access to Twitter. Now I have access to Trump's thing. I'm smacking and putting this thing in here saying that, I'm done with Rocket Man. Tomorrow at 8:30, we're declaring war.
Right.
You want to see chaos. So, oh yeah. So good. You just gave me a nightmare scenario. I'm not even able to sleep tonight. Thanks, Ken. I appreciate that.
That's what we needed, Ken, was Aaron to be more nervous than he is normally. Thanks.
Never coming back on the show again.
No. All right. So we talked about the doomsday scenario. And the irony is, like, I hate FUD, right? Like, FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I hate it when vendors do that. But in this particular instance with business and BEC, we forgot to explain that. BEC, business email compromise. And by the way, while Matt was talking, DMARC stands for Domain-Based Message Authentication Reporting and Conformance. I always forget the C, so it's not just you. All right, so we're going to end this on a positive note. What are you the most hopeful for? So we talked about ending the world. Let's talk about saving the world.
One of the things I've appreciated, and this may be just the people I've been able to interact with over the last several years, as I think as a security community, we're starting to get better about sharing information, and I think the more that we can continue to work together, like we inevitably are a very resilient bunch of people, right? Security is a really tough place to work. The threats don't get easier; they get harder, they get more complex. We talked about what's possibly ahead of us, but at the same time, I think we also make good progress, and I think there's what I like is just kind of where we are as an industry, and I continue to think that we are making strides to do good for the organizations that we work with and we're a part of, and so I look forward to that.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you to your company for pitching in and helping us do a fundraiser. We're really trying really hard to, me personally, raise $1,000 before the end of the month for internet for low income families here in West Michigan. So majority of the proceeds are going to be going to that. So it's a good cause and a good topic. So thank you very much, Ken.